Hello, everyone. Last week we talked about discovery, and that was working with the stakeholder, making sure that we understand the scope of the problem, the stakeholder's needs, the resources that were going to be available to us, and just get a kind of a full interrogation of all parts of the problem as we get ready to sort of look at it. Now we're moving on to the data preparation stage, and this presumes that we've kind of identified the data that we have, the data that we need, and we're going to do some work on getting ready to build a model, getting ready to plan a model. So we'll talk about that stage this week. So the overview, what we're going to do in the data preparation stage is we're going to explore, process, and condition the data prior to analysis and modeling. We'll create a robust environment to explore the data that is different from the production system. That's where we talked about our sandbox. So we'll create a sandbox where we will actually do the data transformation, data prep that is in no way going to impact the production environment. We'll extract, transform, and load data into the sandbox. Another could be, for example, a copy of the database. It's very, very common to, when we're going to actually work with data that comes out of a database, to just take a snapshot of the database and copy it over, assuming that it's copyable. But we can put that into the sandbox, or we can play around with it. It's not going to hurt anything or harm any of the processes that are running. Data preparation is an iterative process, so we will find ourselves going through multiple cycles. So we'll look at fields, and we'll look at relationships of fields, and we'll look at what we're trying to get, and then we'll get an idea of what we're trying to get out of the database, and then that will change. Or every time you discover something about your data set, you open up a whole bunch more questions. So it'll be an iterative process. If we jump ahead too fast, if we don't do careful data prep, and we jump ahead to model planning and model building, we'll probably find that we'll be forced back to phase 2, because when we start putting stuff into the model, we will be like, uh-oh, we forgot to think about this, or we didn't get this particular bit of data, or there's something that's missing. So we want to make sure that we do a good job on our data prep. So first thing we're going to do, preparing the analytic sandbox. That's a big name for a very simple concept, also known as workspace. So whatever workspace we're going to use, either as an individual or as a team, it's going to be where we actually plan things out. So it'll be separate from the production system. So we're going to do any work that we do in the sandbox cannot impact production. We're going to load with good collections of data summarized at different levels. It's very important to involve IT. If your data team or your work is not in the IT group, it's really important to get IT involved, because they're probably going to be the ones who are going to be doing the snapshot into the sandbox or providing you with your data sets. And so you want to have somebody from IT with you so that you can be clear about what you need. You don't want to have to be running back to the IT department to access new data or new fields because you forgot to ask for them, because you're not going to know off the top of your head what you're going to need in every instance. It's easier if you can get IT to help you. And then ensure that the sandbox is of sufficient size. If we're going to replicate a database, we want to make sure that we have enough resources, technology resources, disk space, whatever, to ensure that we have sufficient processing speeds and stuff like that to actually replicate reality. When we build the model and we run the model in the sandbox to verify that the model works, we want to see that we want to have enough resources in the sandbox that we can actually, if we have 5 million records, that we can actually be successful, and we're not going to be limited by the resources. So performing ETLT. So I talked about this in earlier videos. There's two parts to it. There's extract, transform, and load, or there's extract, load, and transform. And together they make up ETLT. They may result in 2 copies of the data set. So both have been in both steps we're going to extract the data. In one, there may be processing or transformation that has occurred before we're able to load the data up. So we can extract data out of a database. Maybe it's multiple fields from multiple tables in a database, but it's not the entire database. So through the extraction, we gather the raw data, but then it may have to be transformed into some other format so it can be loaded in another tool. And then we can load that data up. So that's the first part of extract, transform, and load. But we might also be so that's when in the one there may be processing transformation that has occurred. In the other, there's no processing or transformation that occurs until the data is loaded into the sandbox. So for whatever reason, we're able to get the data, we're able to load it, but then we have to transform it once we have it in the sandbox. So in the first one, the data is extracted, and we have to transform it before we can actually load it into the sandbox. And the second one, we can get it into the sandbox, but we have to transform it afterwards. Basically, they're kind of the same thing. These two strategies are kind of the same thing. It's just, you know, what what do we have to do, and at what point do we have to do it to get the data to load into the sandbox? Either way, the data gets loaded into the sandbox, and we can start to examine it. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to learn about the data. So we're going to clarify the data that the team has access to at the start of the project. We'll identify any gaps in the data that might impact the project, any fields that we might be missing, or any places where we actually have the field, but the field is empty. And we'll identify any overlapping fields. So where we might have duplicate data or kind of data that's telling us the same thing. This lets the team understand any additional data sets that they may need. So when they start, they've got an understanding of the problem through their work with the stakeholder. They've pulled the data, they have an idea of what they need, they've pulled the data, they've transformed it and loaded it into the sandbox, and now they're realizing, wait a minute, we don't have any information on the number of people who've been staffing the call center for the past 4 months. That information exists in another database, we just didn't extract it. So now we have to go get it. So this just kind of lets us sort of do a tactical look at what do we have, is it going to help us, and what do we still need. Then we may have to do some data conditioning, and this is the process for cleaning up the data. So first things first, we might have to look at fields where, if we have 5,000 records in our data sample, and in 2,500 of those records we're missing, a key value, that's missing data. So can we find the data, or can we extrapolate, or can we come up with some other way of being able to condition that? Another thing we might want to do, depending on the strategy that we're using, we might normalize our data set. So we could scale it to z-score or whatever we need to do. So these are transformations on our sample data set. It also allows us to identify what data are valuable and what data can be discarded. So we can use the stuff that we like and we dump the stuff that we don't want. Do we have any data sets that came from multiple sources that we have to merge or join into a single data set? And and then just thinking about what other analysis or what other processing we'll have to do to get that data ready for later analysis. These all need to be tracked, because if we're doing these on a sample data set of maybe 5,000 records, we have to do the same thing on the big data set, the main data set, when we go into production. So we'll have to be clear about what those are. The last thing we can do is we can look for outliers or any evidence of systematic error. So we look at the fields, and we, remember in R where we do the summary, we can look at what is the mean, what is the median, what is the min-max. Summary could tell us information about if there's, like the number of hours worked in a month. If that ranges for most people from 40 to 240, and suddenly you see entries in your data that are showing 2,500 hours worked in a month, which is not physically possible, you got a data problem, and you're going to have to fix that. That could be an outlier, or that could be an evidence of systematic error. If there's widespread and you're seeing a whole lot of 2,500s, then there's something wrong with the way that the data are being tracked or being recorded, and that needs to be addressed and fixed. Lastly, we're going to do a little bit of survey, and I might call this sampling and visualization. So we'll do things like we did in the data mining class. We can do plots and histograms, correlation tables, heat maps. Again, all really trying to get to the point of what is in this data set, what is it telling us? Is it clean? Is it consistent? Does it reveal any initial surprises? You might see that in the correlations. And correlation tables could really be helpful in determining which direction you go with your analysis. Does the data represent the problem of interest, or the population of interest, and does it go into enough detail? Okay. All these are just part of understanding what your data is initially telling you. And that's it for data preparation. We did a little bit of this in the data mining class at the very beginning when we did plots, and we talked about is there data reduction, is there ways that we can reduce the data set. And we actually, in some of our exercises, went through columns of data and eliminated columns. Because they weren't bringing us any value. So this is really what we're doing in this data preparation step, is we're cleaning up the data, we're making sure that the data looks good, we're making sure that the data is actually going to solve the problem or address the concern that the stakeholder has brought to us, and we're going to get to a point where we're pretty sure it's as clean as it's going to get, it's as accurate as it's going to get, and now we're ready to use it to plan out our model.